Good afternoon. My name is Tom Nastic. I'm a public program producer here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today to the William G. McGowan Theater, and also a welcome to everyone who's watching us on the National Archives YouTube channel. Today, our series of noontime author lecture and book signings continues with Herbert Hoover in the White House, The Ordeal of the Presidency, with our special guest, Charles Rappleye. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs that will take place in this theater. Tomorrow night, Wednesday, June 8th at 7 p.m., the National Archives joins with the National Capital Planning Commission and the National Park Service to present a panel discussion, Memorials for the Future, moderated by Jason Schupbach, Director of Design Programs at the National Endowment for the Arts. The discussion will explore how we might develop and experience the next century's memorials, telling more of America's stories. And on Friday, June 10th at noon, we will screen a new documentary film, Jeremiah, which tells us the incredible story of Vietnam prisoner of war Jeremiah Denton. Following the screening, filmmakers Mark Festoso and Luis Blandon, along with James S. Denton, son of Jeremiah Denton, and editor of World Affairs, will discuss the film and answer audience questions. To find out more about these and other programs, exhibits, and events at the National Archives, please consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies outside the theater, and it is also available online at our website, www.archives.gov. Charles Rappleye is an award-winning investigative journalist and editor. He has written extensively on media, law enforcement, and organized crime. He's also the author of Sons of Providence, The Brown Brothers, The Slave Trade, and the American Revolution, and Robert Morris, Financier of the American Revolution. Among the many praises for Herbert Hoover in the White House, Publishers Weekly wrote, Rappleye constructs a deft, filled-out portrait of the 31st president, one that captures, as no one else has, the political and economic snares that brought down Hoover's single term and ruined his reputation forever. By far the best, most readable study of Hoover's presidency to date. After his talk and Q&A, Mr. Rappleye will be signing copies of his book, one level up, outside the archive store. Would you please welcome Charles Rappleye to the National Archives.
Hi there. Thank you, Tom Nastic, for the invitation, and to the National Archives for hosting this. It's nice to see people coming out to hear something more about our 31st president. I think most people are comfortable with their understanding of Hoover, the conventional wisdom on Hoover, that he was a nice guy, well-meaning, sort of pacific individual, maybe not well-suited to the White House, and certainly overwhelmed by the crisis that came on and the politics and the strife that came with the Depression. I was always convinced that that was not the whole picture, that there had to be more to it. I didn't know a whole lot more than that, except that the feeling that there must be more to the story, more nuance, more interest. And that is, I think, what I found in the course of researching and writing this book. And I'd like to share with you some of what I think is the Hoover that, the real Hoover that behind this conventional wisdom, this two-dimensional portrait. Hoover, I think the first thing that I searched for was, who is this guy? Who was Hoover? He was very private, very reserved. He didn't want people to get close to him. Again, not a great attribute for a president or leader of a democracy, but that was his nature. It was something that seemed to jive with the times. Hoover, of course, coming at the height of the Roaring '20s, that period of excess and sort of fad in the American social scene wasn't reflected so much in their politics. They tended to gravitate towards less colorful, more colorless leaders, people like Calvin Coolidge, who preceded Hoover in the White House, and then Herbert Hoover himself, who had served 7 years as Secretary of Commerce in the post-war period, so that he could claim as much credit as anyone for the economic progress and success of the 1920s, which was a great period of growth and development and prosperity here in the U.S. So he was able to run for president on a platform of continuing what had been happening before. His campaign was unusual. He made a total of 5 speeches for his campaign. And in between those speeches, he would get on a train and go back to his house in Washington and not speak to reporters, not give interviews, a stealth candidate, kind of, but very popular and elected in a landslide and with the full confidence of the American people. Even so, Hoover was divided in his mind over the question of whether he should run for president, whether he was the right guy for it, whether he could adapt to the job. Hoover was conflicted in many things, and almost everything, really. And I'll start with a passage that highlights that in a way that I thought was revealing. It was a Saturday afternoon in 1932. Roosevelt had not yet been named as his principal opponent in the election to come. Hoover's bid for re-election. And in this period, Hoover spent a rare free hour chatting with a journalist named H.V. Kaltenborn, a reporter who early on made the switch from print to the more immediate medium of radio. It was more a conversation than an interview, and Hoover was feeling free and glib. But he was president, after all, and before it was over, the discussion turned to the upcoming election. Kaltenborn asked Hoover if he were worried about his campaign prospects. No, not at all, Hoover replied quickly. After a pause, he decided he ought to explain himself. The reason I'm not worried is because I don't give a damn whether I'm elected, re-elected, or not. Here was Hoover's old ambivalence about politics, braced now by 3 trying years in the White House. It was a candid remark, but not exactly true, and it carried the potential for real damage. Kaltenborn ended his visit soon after Hoover's statement, and a few minutes later, Hoover called in Ted Joslin, his press secretary, and queried vaguely as to what he might know about Kaltenborn. Joslin said he knew him from a few years back as a correspondent at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. Hoover then asked Kaltenborn if Kaltenborn understood the current White House ground rules for reporters that, quote, all talks with the president are confidential. Joslin said he couldn't say for sure. Then run him down, Hoover barked. I said something that would cause a world sensation if repeated publicly. Joslin jumped. He caught up with Kaltenborn just as he was leaving the White House, and the story was successfully squelched. It was a typical case of Hoover second-guessing himself and a nice demonstration of Hoover's divided mind. You'll have to excuse me. I left my water, and I will speak louder. Those close to Hoover were familiar with this phenomenon of his indecision. And again, looking for sources close to Hoover who can interpret him for us, I find Lou Hoover, his wife, Lou Henry Hoover, who on the eve of Bert Hoover running for president, she felt obliged to explain to her sons just what it was that was being contemplated here and how it was that their father was going about it. Hoover was a geologist by training and an engineer by trade, an industrial entrepreneur who made his fortune by exploiting an underutilized and sometimes abandoned mining operations all over the world. He worked on 6 continents and had, before he entered politics, had a very successful consultancy with offices on 3 continents and headquarters in London. Such enterprises involved deliberation and risk, a process Lou Hoover described in a letter to one of her sons. In considering an electoral contest, Lou wrote, Hoover approached it, quote, just as he takes everything, which means in his own particular engineering way. She went on to explain, for an election or even an appointed post, Hoover's method was to consider who might be available for the job and whether he himself was best fitted for the position. Should the answer be in the affirmative, and for Hoover that was often the case, then he looked at the possibility of success. It was always a question of probability. There were no certainties, not with, as Lou put it, ever so many perfectly indeterminable factors. But this was just the beginning. Having made the decision to go ahead, then, this quoting Lou, then characteristically he began to study all the points in favor of the other party, all against himself, just as he used to study all the adverse factors in a mine that had to be developed. And always he saw all the possible ones, even the ones that never materialized, so that he could be ready to combat them if he did. Here on the cusp of, and that's the end of the quote, here on the cusp of where decision led to action was where the darkness set in. Quote, it was the position he would get in engineering projects about this time, of being very pessimistic. He sees all the possible advantage that may come to the other side, all the wise steps they could take, all the possible misfortunes that might befall his own cause. Whether intrinsic to Hoover's character as an element of strategy, this phase of dark premonition could be maddening. But to those close to him, like Hoover himself, they simply had to ride it out. Quote, I should begin to wonder what the prospects were myself, Lou confessed to her sons, were I not so accustomed to see this phase come on. Instead, she had learned that this darkness was preamble to a certain clarity. Lou came, quote, to realize that when he built up all the possible protection against these very same possible advantages against him, thus girded, Hoover would sally forth. That was Lou's explanation of her husband's deliberation, some would call it vacillation, and when he got into the White House, he went through these peregrinations on many key decisions to the point that within just a few months of taking the White House, after declaring bold initiatives in agriculture and trade, things started to bog down. He had called a special session in Congress, and the Congress was caught up in tariff debates that seemed interminable, and yet Hoover failed to step to the fore, failed to enforce his will, and the pundits, the observers of the political scene saw a White House adrift. Now again, this is before the Depression, some of it before October of '29 when the Depression announced itself with the Wall Street crash, but even after that, it takes time for people to recognize a depression as opposed to a downturn or a market correction. So the Depression was still not on the front of the national agenda come early 1930, but Hoover very much was, to the point where one of the great pundits of the time, Walter Lippmann, in a cover story in Harper's Bazaar, felt obliged to come forward with the question that really all of the nation was wondering about here in 1930. and Lippmann in this essay with the title, "The Peculiar Weakness of Mr. Hoover." So you get the sense of people coming on to the idea that there's something wrong here. Lippmann wondered, quote, "Why is it that events have so spectacularly eluded the control of a man who, with fine purposes and high abilities, had set himself the ideal of controlling them?" Lippmann, answering his own question, "My own notion is that a close examination of Mr. Hoover's conduct in the critical matters will disclose a strange weakness which renders him indecisive at the point of battle where the battle can be won or lost. This weakness appears at the point where, in order to win, he would have to intervene in the hurly-burly of conflicting wills which are the living tissue of popular government." End quote. The pattern was there for all to see. When the lines were drawn and the contenders looked for conviction, Hoover tended to fade away, his voice mute and his purpose obscure. Knowing Hoover was new to elected office, Lippmann laid the president's failings to the vagaries of the democratic process. Quote, "He is baffled and worried, his action paralyzed by his own inexperience in the very special business of democracy." Now, Lew would say that this was his process. He's just doing what he does to come to the final decision. But in the context of the White House, it wasn't getting over. Again, the source was in the system. Hoover prized certainty, Lippmann wrote, and was, quote, "excessively diffident in the presence of normal irrationality in democracy." Hoover was quickly emerging as a caution to those who saw the dry logic of the engineer as an antidote to the practice of politics. Quote, "In the realm of reason, he is an unusually bold man. In the realm of unreason, he is, for a statesman, an exceptionally thin-skinned and bewildered man." So that's the verdict on Hoover that they rendered in 1930. Again, before the Depression was really a factor in this. So you have a guy who's internally conflicted, unable to get himself across to the public, in a sense, one hand tied behind his back by the time the Depression hits, when his leadership skills and his ability to achieve legislative goals was most necessary, when he needed it the most. So you can see how, entering the Depression, the odds were already stacked against him. And Hoover felt this. He realized that things weren't working out. And so you get a picture, again, a picture you never see outside of, or in the general impression of Hoover and even of presidents. Within the White House, Hoover was frustrated, disappointed, and really in something of a crisis. And I'd like to read another passage of how that, of how that manifested inside the White House. As the frustrations mounted and the long days piled on one after another, Hoover started to show the strain. "The president is dog-tired," Ted Joslin, the press secretary, noted in July. This is July 1931. And this is a period when really international capitalism is starting to break down. Britain is being forced off the gold standard. The Depression is now clearly a worldwide phenomenon. Nobody really has any answers. How he stands up to the pressure, Joslin writes, is a mystery to me. Seeking somehow to ease Hoover's burden, Joslin played a wild card. He contacted Byron Price, a well-liked Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press. The president needed someone to alter his outlook. Quote, "He is in a state, and maybe a talk with you will do him good," Joslin told Price. He made clear this was not a matter for publication. "It's not an interview. just a talk. Price was intrigued and upon being ushered into Hoover's office at the White House, astonished. Quote, "He didn't look to me like the Hoover I'd been seeing," Price wrote later in his personal notes. Quote, "His hair was rumpled. He was almost crouching behind the desk, and he burst out at me with an angry volley of words, not against me or the press, but against the politicians and the foreign governments. Absolutely unbridled language." Now, Hoover's friends will talk about how he learned to swear like miners in the Australian outback, which is where he got started in his career. We never get those verbatim quotes, but so we can only fill it in with our imagination. But in the midst of tense and interminable negotiations, Hoover was boiling over. Price made careful notes of the encounter and provides a verbatim quote from the embattled president. Quote, "And now I am asked to take the blame," Hoover fumed. "Is it my fault that those selfish men over the whole world have refused to see the folly of their policies until it was too late? Is it my fault that France, our ally, has stood blindly in the way of settlement and cooperation?" Hoover was mad at France, but his anger encompassed the whole economic disaster that had so compromised his term in office. Quote, "Over a period of years as president and in the cabinet, I have done all I could to avert the terrible situation we are in today. But it was not enough," Hoover complained. "The original sin was committed at Versailles," Hoover said, "and those follies were aggravated by, quote, stupidity and stubbornness." Whatever Ted Joslin was thinking when he arranged this encounter, it appears to have worked. Price kept his confidence, and Hoover invited him back repeatedly, always off the record, and always to vent his anger. I'll just finish with this coda, but of all the dark days, of all of Hoover's dark days, the summer of 1931 may have been the most frustrating, the most emotional. It was only then that Hoover realized, however far he might reach, however hard he might push, the global economic collapse that began 20 months before was not going to turn around like some of the depressions of the past. He recognized now, as John Maynard Keynes had written a few months before, we are living this year in the shadow of one of the greatest economic catastrophes of modern history. Another note on Hoover and his frustration and his demeanor in the White House comes from his connection to a guy named James McLafferty. Now, McLafferty kept a detailed diary, which I found illuminating and really useful and quite remarkable. And he was a former congressman who had briefly worked with Hoover at the Commerce Department before going back into private shipping in Oakland, California. Upon Hoover's election, McLafferty made his way to Washington, like throngs of people who were here for the inauguration. He made his way into the White House, which was open at the time, and in his McLafferty sort of fashion, he carefully positioned himself by the door of the White House with the idea that he would be the first face that Hoover would see when Hoover entered the White House as president. He pulled off this little trick, congratulated the president, and went on his way. A year later, with Hoover beleaguered, McLafferty comes back and proposes a meeting with Hoover. Hoover agrees, and the following week, McLafferty returns, and thus begins a continuing sub rosa collaboration. The two met regularly, McLafferty slipping in and out of the White House early in the morning or late in the day, without the knowledge of the press or even most of the White House staff. Between visits, McLafferty haunted the cafeterias and lobbies of Congress, touting the policies of the administration and sounding the sentiments and loyalties of his former colleagues in the legislature. Then he would report back to Hoover, serving the president as a conduit, a fixer, and sometimes as a sounding board. In this first encounter, Hoover was having his first challenge on the question of veterans. This was not the bonus bill that became so famous later. This was a bill that would extend disability benefits to veterans whether they had been injured in the service or not. So it would dramatically expand the coverage and the cost of veterans' benefits. The bill carried a price tag of $11 million and invited a much costlier expansion were it to be opened up. This was for the veterans of Spanish-American War, and the threat was that it would also sooner or later get applied to veterans of the World War. Hoover vetoed the bill on May 28. It was the first veto of his presidency, but it hardly slowed the movement in Congress. 4 days later, during a break in the tariff debates, both houses voted to override. Now in June, the Senate was moving to expand coverage and benefits for millions more veterans from the Great War. It was a signal moment. On issues ranging from the tariff to political patronage, Hoover's priorities seemed to get lost in the interface of policy and politics. But the hard logic of the balance sheet seemed to clarify things for the president. When it came to government spending, Hoover shed his timidity. To his mind, limiting spending was a matter of, quote, protecting the American people, a duty he embraced with verve. For the most part, Hoover had muddled through the first year in office, preaching cooperation but failing to define himself with Congress. Now he had found his mission. McLafferty was delighted to see the president in such a combative mood. Like so many others, he saw Hoover's central problem to be one of leadership. He wanted Hoover to hit harder, to drive his enemies, to rule even his friends. Watching Hoover vent his outrage over the pension bill, McLafferty egged him on. The lawmakers who lined up against him had done so for fear of their constituent backlash. The answer was to make those politicians fear Hoover even more. Quote, this is McLafferty quoting himself, telling the president, let them all know if they are not for you, you are not for them. McLafferty told Hoover, make them fear you. Now this is not in Hoover's character. He is a Quaker. He is very reserved and sort of, he's very into dignity and decorum, but he's listening to McLafferty, and McLafferty has his influence. And I'll pick it up a year later when the Democrats, now it's another pension bill, this time the veterans bonus. Hoover ruled that his people would make no effort to impede the bill. He wanted it as bad as possible, he told his staff. He wanted it as bad as possible, the better to assert his planned veto. It was a cynical strategy Hoover described through clenched teeth. He was very tense, McLafferty observed. He was cutting his words short, and his voice, never loud, was low. I don't want to compromise, the grim-faced president told his political aide. I want the bill to go to the limit so it will arouse the country so that it cannot pass over a veto. McLafferty, who always saw political matters in black and white, encouraged Hoover's intransigence. My advice, McLafferty said, my advice is that you figuratively kick them in the face. Don't show any mercy right now. If you do, it will be heralded as weakening as on your part. Your enemies won't have it any other way. The public will say you are weakening. Don't give them the chance. So here's this guy in the White House, buffeted by events, set upon by his aides, driving him into corners that he's not comfortable with, losing the allegiance and the attention of the American people, failing to make that connection, really a beleaguered and that whole idea of an overwhelmed president. Except when it came to policy, when it came to how to deal with the crisis of the Depression, Hoover did not lose his bearings. And here I will contradict the conventional wisdom on this score as well. He showed resourcefulness, he showed determination, and at key moments, he showed vision. I doubt you're going to hear that a lot about Hoover, but I think if you look through his record and his course in office, it's hard to escape some of that idea. And I would say that it set in quickly, early. He recognized in the Wall Street crash, as few did, there were actually people at the time who said, oh, this crash is just what we need. There's been all this money being siphoned into speculation, into the crazy action on the stock market, to the point that there's no money left for capital investment, for what capital is supposed to do, which is to fund business and industry. This is good for the economy, to have a crash like this, to shake out the bad money, to focus money where it ought to be. They were wrong about that, but that was a very popular theory at the time. Hoover was less taken with that sort of blue sky version of the crash. And instead, well, he did two things. One was to issue a very short statement that sort of captures the public picture of Hoover as the Pollyanna who's saying everything's fine. He did issue a statement saying the fundamental business of the American economy is healthy, everything's okay, just maintain your confidence, we're going to be all right. At the same time, in what was one of his innovations, he called to Washington the leaders of business and industry and labor and agriculture in a series of conferences, businessmen's conferences, they were called in the press. And here, Hoover spoke his mind in a more candid fashion. Or as I say here, addressing the first of these conferences, Hoover opened with an appraisal far more candid and more gloomy than anything he shared with the public. He had called this group together, said the president, only because he, quote, viewed the crisis more seriously than a mere stock market crash. This was an instinctive judgment. There were, as Hoover pointed out, no means available to gauge the depth of the damage. But Hoover felt confident in warming that quote. We could expect a long and difficult period at best, and there must be much liquidation of inflated values, debts, and prices, with heavy penalties on the nation. Hoover's point was not to incite fear. There was plenty of that to go around. His goal was to instill awareness of the gravity of the moment and a sense of mission going forward. The immediate duty, as Hoover put it, of these businessmen was, quote, to consider the human problem of unemployment and distress, unquote. Previous crises had seen the immediate liquidation of labor with wage cuts and layoffs. Hoover opposed such steps, quote, with every instinct. Labor was not a commodity, he insisted, but an entity comprised of what he called human homes. Besides, slashing payroll would magnify the shock of the market collapse, quote, by suddenly reducing purchasing power, unquote. Wage cuts might prove inevitable, Hoover told his assembly of great national employers. But wages should fall as a last resort, delayed at least until the cost of living came down, another likely result of prolonged economic doldrums. Hopefully then, the worst hardships might be avoided. So you have Hoover recognizing that this depression could get rough, that it could take a big toll in unemployment, doing what he could to exhort the major employers of the country to hold on. And they did through around September 1931. So for the first year, you really have these employers holding the line. And then they start to cave. England goes off gold. There's a global crisis. People start abandoning their conception of how you run an economy and their whole idea of the economy. People didn't see it as a problem in capitalism. They saw it as a death rattle of capitalism, just as Marx had predicted, just as the Soviet Union was predicting after their October Revolution. And you saw countries around the planet, peoples and nations, turning against capitalism per se, in Italy and in Germany and in Argentina going for state socialism, in other countries for leftist revolution. But in America, Hoover held the line. He said it was not it was not the death of capitalism, it was a crisis of capitalism, but capitalism was the way that we were going to climb out of it. Very few other people were saying that at the time. It's interesting, in America, we are a capitalist country. People don't like to sort of claim that, but there at the crisis, Hoover recognized it and asserted that that's what we are about and that's what we're going to do. And more than just defending capitalism, he diagnosed the situation. He saw it not as a crisis of capitalism, but as a crisis of credit. And certainly that was the dynamic that was going on, with collapsing values of real estate, of railroad bonds, of all the assets that the banks, the financial structure was settled on. All those assets were frozen, and the capital markets were, or as Hoover called it, it was a paralysis of credit. So what did he do? He started attacking the paralysis of credit. He set about thawing all those frozen assets. He reinvigorated the federal land banking system, agricultural land banks. He created the home loan banking system, one that home loans were one of the big drags in the meltdown of the Depression. Home construction ground to a halt. Home financing was an old, moribund system. Mortgages in those days rarely covered more than half the property, ran for 3 to 5 years. If you took out a second mortgage, you'd be paying upward of 20%. He attacked this by creation of a federal home loan bank board to provide credit to homeowners and to mortgage institutions. It was an unpopular idea because members of both parties were very, very skeptical of bringing the government into finance and business. That was unprecedented in his time, and it was Hoover who first crossed that threshold. He got a lot of opposition from the Fed as well, but by the end of his term, he had established the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. And the third plank, and the most important, was something called the Reconstruction Finance Corp, a lending entity that was created by the government, funded to the tune of $2 billion, which is half the federal budget at that time, and devoted to injecting capital by loan, making loans to troubled banks, to troubled railroads, to keep them online, to keep them functioning, and to keep the system of credit in motion. He took a lot of heat for it. It was called the billionaire dole, and it contributed mightily, I expect, to his ultimate rejection by the voters. But it was successful in keeping the banks afloat, and the RFC became it stayed in place when Franklin Roosevelt took over, and it became one of the central agencies in his drive for recovery. I'll close by suggesting where it is that Hoover really went wrong in his economic analysis. And that was in his allegiance to gold, the gold standard, which inhibited his range of reaction and his efforts to revive the economy. He was adamantly opposed to the idea of inflating your way out of the recession, the depression. Other countries around the globe started going that direction. He tried to hold out. It went against him, and it became the policy of the Roosevelt administration to go ahead and devalue, like Britain, getting off of gold, letting the currencies float and float downward so that exports were cheaper, and it would thaw out the economy that way. So Hoover, this was one of his tenets that he clung to. It worked against him. I will say, now looking back after 80 years, we've had 80 years of debt financing, deficit financing, the sort of financing that couldn't operate under a gold standard. We've accumulated enormous, it's been fairly successful so far, but we're now looking at the precipice of mountainous debt all around the world. It's not, I think the verdict is, the jury's still out on whether abandoning gold and going for floating currencies and floating debt is actually the solution that will carry us over the long term. But that's for the future. In 1930 and 1932, those questions were well ahead. But that's what I found in looking at Hoover, looking behind the myth and trying to plumb what it was like for him in the White House at this time of crisis. And I appreciate you coming out to hear about it. Thanks a lot. Yes, any questions? Sir.
Thank you for the talk. Two questions. One is anything, if he had been reelected, what his New Deal policy might have entailed. You talked a little bit about the financial things he was looking at, but anything beyond that that either was accepted by Roosevelt's policies or was not that helped to contribute. And also anything you can comment about his international policies if he was reelected and as the war continued towards World War II, how he would have probably handled that in speculation.
Before you answer, Charles, I have an announcement to make before we continue with the Q&A. Unfortunately, I just found out from the archive store that there are no copies of Mr. Rappleye's books here today. I apologize for that. But if you do go up to the bookstore after the Q&A, you can place an order with them, and maybe you will still get the 15% discount on the book. Again, I apologize for that, but there are no books available after the lecture. Sorry.
There goes the signatures. Anyway, let's see. The question is, how would Hoover's, what do I believe Hoover would have done had he had another term in his economic policy?
Yeah, something like a New Deal, how would he get, you talked about some things he was doing with banking, but getting people back to work. You talked about trying to get people to keep people employed, and anything that, to be reelected, it would seem like that would be something that he would be, obviously we don't have television at that time and everything else, but to get the word out that these are his ideas, why you should reelect me, if there was anything like that that was occurring.
Well, he certainly made the case that he believed that he had actually put the elements in place for a recovery. And he believed, too, that the trick was for people to believe that they were going to stick with the gold standard, stick with a solid dollar. And he believed that the election of Roosevelt, that when Roosevelt was elected, people assumed, correctly as it turned out, that the dollar was going to get devalued. And as a consequence, people started pulling their dollars out of the banks. And it brought on a banking crisis that he believed he had largely solved with the RFC. Instead, there was the banking crisis, driven at least in part by fear that U.S. would go off gold, and so that the currency would no longer be worth what it was worth, which is exactly what happened. And so the problems at the banks got worse and worse up to the day of the inauguration. All through the interregnum, the period between Roosevelt's election and his taking office. In those days, that was a longer period. It went from the election till March. And all through that period, the banks kept sort of getting weaker and weaker. And in the last week before the election, the country was swept by bank closures, closing in the face of depositors wanting their money out. Again, Hoover believed that's because people understood that Roosevelt was going to devalue the dollar. However, Roosevelt coming in immediately sparked a thaw in public fear, and he did it in the way that Hoover would never be able to do it, by making a statement that resonated with the people and changed their way of seeing things. No longer afraid, they saw their role as getting back into the system, cooperating. People were bringing money back into the banks in wheelbarrows. It was a phenomenon. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. And consequently, the bank crisis did pass. But part of that was because the banks were actually in pretty good shape, and part of that was because of Hoover's RFC and the millions of dollars that had been injected to keep the banks afloat. So the question of how Hoover would have proceeded as opposed to Roosevelt, it depends. If there had been no bank crash, then it might be true that Hoover could have continued with his program. He saw, and it's in the books, it's in the economic measurements, there was a recovery underway until the election. And then things started to, and there were 2 or 3 points at which the Depression economy started to recover, and then things happened, like bank failures in Europe, boom, that started another decline. And then Roosevelt's election, and boom, that started another decline. So Hoover was clinging to these glimmers of hope that might have turned into something had not politics, global and national, got in the way. Whether that would have worked out is too many variables for me.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, sir. You mentioned earlier that Hoover didn't want people getting close to him. And, you know, any president or any world leader, for that matter, has to display a persona of strength and confidence. Do you think that he didn't want people getting close to him because he didn't want to display a vulnerable side to him? He didn't want people to see a vulnerable side to him, or was it just part of his personality?
A part of his personality, and Hoover grew up an orphan, lost both parents by the time he was 10, was shipped to different relatives. At 16, he was working at a land office and sleeping behind the desk. He didn't get formal schooling, but he studied math in his spare time to the point that when a recruiter came from the first class at Stanford University, was just trolling up the coast to look for likely candidates, he was introduced to the young Hoover, and Hoover took a test and really impressed him with his self-taught achievements, and that was the beginning of his sort of joining the world in a sort of successful way. He got his education, he went into mining, he made a lot of money, but he was always unusually you know, he had this conflicted thing. Somebody called him a gregarious hermit. He didn't want to, he wanted to go off into the wilderness, but he wanted a lot of people around there with him. And the more you see of Hoover, the more he's conflicted in all these different things. He wants to be president, but he doesn't want to run for it. He wants to lead the country, but he doesn't want to have to talk to people he doesn't know. He's a very unusual character.
Thank you.
I've heard Hoover criticized about signing Smoot-Hawley. And
About?
Smoot-Hawley.
Yes.
And that was a major mistake, and that led to worldwide further depression because of the tariff going up.
Well, I think there's two answers to that. One is that the people who've looked at it since, as an economic question, consider that Smoot-Hawley was a small factor, that the decline in international trade was a big factor, but that was a depression thing, not a Smoot-Hawley thing. The tariffs did go up. There were retaliatory tariffs, but the collapse of values, commodity values across the planet is the thing that was the depression. The other thing is, Smoot-Hawley was a failure of Hoover's. He set out, he called the special session of Congress to deal specifically with the problems of agriculture. And they opened up the tariff schedule in order to raise agricultural tariffs and put them on a par with the industrial. The idea was to balance things. And they felt that, correctly, that agriculture had been left behind in the big recovery post-war, the Roaring '20s. Industrial America was doing great. Agricultural America, rural America, which was about half of America at the time, was left behind. And Hoover ran for office. One of his big planks was to do something about agriculture, and the tariff revision was supposed to be part of it. But having called, and he expressly called for limited revision of the tariff in order to balance the interest of agriculture and industry. But having called the special session, he sat back in the White House and clammed up. And he said that this is a job for the legislature. That's not what the White House is supposed to do. I believe in the separation of powers and these sort of things. But as a consequence, you open up the tariff schedule. Now, it's interesting. I've been told I go too long on this, so I don't want to put everybody out of, but I'll go a little bit, which is the tariffs. The tariffs were the law of the land in those days. We had hundreds of tariffs on basically anything you could name that could be manufactured abroad was subject to a tariff. More than that, tariffs were the official policy of the Republican Party. It was the Democrats who were the free traders. I'm not quite sure how that completely reversed, but that was the case. And the problem with tariff is once you open it up, everybody who can benefit by a tariff comes in, and they had hundreds of they had hearings that went through the summer, into the fall, into the winter, parades of industrialists coming in and getting their rates raised, and the whole question of agriculture got totally shunted aside. And you had Hoover's critics coming out and saying, what are you going to do about this tariff? And he said, it's not my problem. And when it finally reached his desk, he said he hated the bill, but he signed it. He couldn't, and he didn't have any choice. He had opened the door to this. He had sat by while it all happened. It's under the auspices of his party in Congress. I mean, it's a little like Obama and the health bill, and he signed one that he maybe was not the one he wanted, but it was the only one he could get out of it, and he had to live with it. So Hoover, ever after, has been the guy who had to answer for the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and it was the first sign of how ill-suited he was to being president. over here.
Thank you. A few questions. One of the questions that really has always fascinated me with Herbert Hoover, who to a certain extent he and Calvin Coolidge, et cetera, and the policies they took, the hands-off policies they took, which kind of was against what was somewhat going on in the progressive era early on, is the fact that he played a tremendous role. I'm from the Caribbean, but I grew up in the Netherlands. And he played a tremendous role in the process of rebuilding Europe and doing a lot of issues to help Europe after the First World War.
Sure.
With the tremendous problems, you know, with the homelessness, the destruction of the countries, and et cetera, all the needs and wants. So he could have seen at that point in time the tremendous role that government can play to deal with problems, right?
Yes.
And then here you have this problem. Again, it's well known that he was a strong free market capitalist, a strong free, classical kind of economic type of guy, you know, hands off of government, deregulated, leave business. I mean, you even suggested it, that he was saying basically that the economy had to seek out itself. It had to seek itself out of the problems it was in, to a certain extent, right? That's what it had to do.
Although
he did those things, right? No, but the issue is, another issue that I would like to talk about is what was his relationship towards, for example, you know, what was going on in those days, the Harlem Renaissance, right? The African Americans coming into the cities, starting to play an important role. What was his relationship to them? Was he in favor of that? Was he didn't care? Was he a racist? What was his attitudes towards black people and their struggle?
I'll take that as two questions because I want to address the first thing you mentioned, which is interesting, and that is Hoover became famous in America for his reconstruction efforts in Europe. First, during the war, he started something called Belgian Relief. The people of Belgium were caught between the combatant armies, the civilians of Belgium, millions of people faced with starvation. And Hoover organized something called Belgian Relief, which was to get food into Belgium. And it was a huge operation. He had 600 ships sailing under his flag. And it was a neutral flag. And it was the only fleet that had permission to cross, that had permission from the Germans and from the British and from the French that his ships could cross combatant lines to deliver food to Belgium. And he, at the end of the war, he came home with this reputation as the great humanitarian. So when the Depression hit, everybody's like, where's Hoover and all the relief projects and all that stuff? But I think what people don't recognize is that Hoover did experience what was going on in Europe after the war firsthand. He was there. He saw the piles of bodies. He saw the dogs roaming in the streets. And that never happened in America. He understood the difference between a true social catastrophe like post-war Europe and the difficulties that the Americans encountered in the Depression. And he drew a distinction between the two, that in the Depression, the Americans would weaken themselves by waiting for somebody to come in and help them and take care of them. And he really believed that the only way that America would get back on its feet was by each person, the whole individual ethic thing. And people were really baffled by it at the time. They were like, how come? And Hoover never really expressly addressed that. You can only suppose, you can only guess as to what was his thinking. But I believe that's where it lay, is that when he was in his rescue mode, it was for people who needed that kind of rescue. And he never felt that the situation in the U.S. required that kind of response. Second question on race. Hoover was a very conventional guy, and in certain ways, and certainly in his racial outlook. He had traveled the world. He considered white Caucasian America to be the racial apogee. He thought that the Chinese were, I mean, he had different, with the racial code of America in the 1930s, he was subscribed to that, so that the Chinese were wrong this way, and different races had different capacities, and he had it all categorized and like that. But he also was big on self-help, and he endorsed the sort of Tuskegee strain of black self-help. He was concerned about the sharecropping system in the South and how it excluded black independence or fostered black dependence, and he made efforts to change that situation. Not big ones, but he did on occasion try to steer things in the direction of more autonomy for black agricultural operations and that kind of thing. Politically, he got into trouble on the race question when he ran. He was the first Republican to win elections in the Deep South, to win some of the states in the Deep South since the Civil War. And he did so in part by the way he played it in the South. The Republican Party had different, the Republican Party didn't win anything in Jim Crow South because they were mostly black, because all the white supremacists were with the Democrats. There were, however, Republican Party organizations in each state in the South, partly because they got to distribute all the federal judgeships and so on from all the successive Republican administrations. So federal jobs always went to people through the Republican parties in the different states. Some of those parties were strictly white supremacists. Some of them were what they called black and tan, where the blacks and the liberal whites worked together in the party organization in those southern states. Hoover's electoral strategy was to take those parties as they were. So in black and tan states, he worked with the black and tan people to get their delegates. In the lily white, that's what they called the white supremacy parties, he worked with the lily whites. And as that strategy finally came under pressure, I won't go into the incidents that brought it to the fore, but ultimately blacks around the country saw that as not pragmatic politics, but as hypocrisy, and turned against Hoover and the Republicans. That may have contributed to Roosevelt's broad success.
Hi.
Yes.
I suppose you know that Herbert Hoover was left-handed, like many engineers. And
I didn't know
at,
that engineers were left-handed.
They're disproportionate that way. There are certain occupations where it's disproportionate. Architects and computer programmers and nurses. And so you look and see where left-handed politicians rise to leadership, and what are the conditions, and then what happens, like James Garfield or Harry Truman or Barack Obama. Hoover became a secret pen pal of Harry Truman. And often the world turns upside down. It's very, this is what happens when a lefty is in the driver's seat so often. So you can analyze an incredible amount of things that way. Why does it happen, and what does it say, and what's going to happen, and why are we surprised? So I'd like to hear, discussions of left-handed politics, who are left-handed senators, and how to, we don't talk about that. Lefties, you try to talk about lefties and they don't know it. The other thing is, I'm a member of Friends Media of Washington, which was founded in 1930 when we had our first Quaker president, and Herbert Hoover was member #1, and he kept his membership the rest of his life. And an awful lot of his patterns
You're a member of what?
I'm a Quaker.
Oh,
Friends
Quaker.
Media of Washington, the only Quaker meeting in the District of Columbia.
Yes.
And he was a Quaker lifelong.
He was a Quaker.
Yeah, and a lot of his patterns are typical of Quaker mind and history, the thought and action, what you do and why. And his mother was a recorded minister in West Branch, Iowa, which means you're recognized as a serious Quaker spiritual thinker. And you look at that, and you know, where is the Quaker mind in Richard Nixon or Abraham Lincoln's great-grandparents or Grover Cleveland's grandmother? It's not weird when you find out who are the Quakers and what is their history and culture, and people don't talk about that either. So why not? And have you?
Well, as to lefties, I think you have to figure out if it's the circumstances that bring the lefties to office or the lefties who create the circumstances.
Well, it's both. You travel a certain way. I mean, who predicted
I've
Harry
not
Truman would
stopped
become
to consider
president? James Garfield was a dark horse, and a year later he was dead before the age of 50. You know, each time, you know, you move some way and something happens, and we don't ask, how is your brain built, and why is this person in the driver's seat? And it explains a lot, you know, but I don't hear the conversation.
As to Hoover being a Quaker, he was a Quaker. He was not a particularly observant Quaker.
Well, that's your definition.
Well, he didn't go to meeting. And in fact, after he left college, he didn't go to meeting, and during World War I, in his relief efforts, he got into a dispute with the American Friends Service Committee and denounced and renounced them, and only resumed his meeting attendance upon election to the White House. I don't think his Quaker, I mean, I think it probably had to do with his pacifism, and I think it might have had something to do with his character, but I don't think it had a lot to do with his overt thinking of how he was going to conduct affairs in the White House.
We have time for one more quick
One more?
Yes, my question, was he at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and what else did he do during the time of World War I besides all that Belgian relief? You know?
Well, that was a big job.
Yeah.
But he was at the Paris Peace Conference. He was cited by John Maynard Keynes as one of the leading lights of the peace conference. He and Keynes would get together and lament the developments and the direction of the peace conference. He was among many observers at the time who said that this was a disaster and would lead to a new round of conflict. He was also on the a foreign debt commission, which was the sort of residue of the peace conference, was setting up all the debts and the reparations and all the payments that were going to go around. Germany paying everybody for everything that had happened. France and England paying off their debts to the U.S., which were almost as onerous. And Hoover, in his typically enigmatic fashion, initially said that we should write off all these debts, that they're foolish and they will only lead to trouble. Then he signed off on the Debt Commission's recommendation that no, we have to collect these and we're going to follow this program. And then in 1931, no, I guess that was, no, 31, when England is being forced off gold, when the banks of Europe are crashing and putting pressure on the banks in the US, Hoover, one of his dramatic efforts to sort of interrupt this cycle of meltdown that was going on across the continents, called for a one-year moratorium on all international debts, all the reparations, all of that. So he returned to it, and he saw that these debt overhangs were dragging down these different economies. He was typically adamant that we're only going to do it for a year and you have to resume payments after that. But in fact, after a year of not paying, the nations of Europe decided they just weren't going to pay anymore. And that was the end of it. But yes, Hoover was at the conference and influential there, an advisor to Wilson, and that's what got him, that's another thing that sort of brought him into the circles of Washington influence and ended up with him appointed as Secretary of Commerce under Warren Harding. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry I can't sign for you.